What happens when your most private pain is turned into a public spectacle? For one woman, a night meant to celebrate success became a living nightmare. At the prestigious Visionaries of Tomorrow gala, her ex-husband, a man she'd once loved, used his moment of triumph to publicly humiliate her, to paint her as a failure. The crowd was silent, the cameras were rolling, and she was utterly alone. But they all underestimated one thing. They didn't know who was sitting beside her. This isn't just a story of revenge. It's a story of devastating truth and what happens when a quiet man decides he's heard enough. The scent of rain on hot asphalt clung to Eliza Reid's memory of their final argument. It was a smell of endings of something vibrant being quenched by a sudden cold downpour. That was 2 years ago. 2 years since she had walked out of the minimalist grey and chrome apartment she'd once tried to call home, leaving behind Gregory Shaw and the ghost of the woman she'd been. Their marriage had started like a modern fairy tale. He was a brilliant, ambitious programmer, with a jawline as sharp as his code, and she was a budding perfumer, a woman who saw the world in scents and notes. Eliza believed in art, in nuance, in the slow, patient craft of extracting beauty from the world. Gregory believed in disruption, in scaling in binary outcomes, success or failure. For a while their differences were magnetic. He called her his bohemian muse, and she was captivated by his drive. But as Gregory's career ascended, his world became smaller, more rarefied, and he began to resent the space her dreams occupied. Her workshop, a fragrant, chaotic haven of glass beakers, dried botanicals, and essential oil distillers, was an unmonetized mess in his eyes. "When are you going to turn this little hobby into something real, Eliza?" He'd ask, not with curiosity, but with the weary condescension of a man burdened by her lack of ambition. He never understood that for her it was real. The delicate balance of creating a fragrance that could evoke a memory, the ghost of a grandmother's garden. The salt spray of a first trip to the coast was a profound and intricate magic. But Gregory only saw balance sheets. He saw her turning down a lucrative offer to create a generic mass-market scent for a soap company as a personal failing. "It would have been a compromise," she tried to explain. "It wouldn't have been mine." "Mine doesn't pay the bills," he had scoffed conveniently, forgetting that her family trust paid for the very apartment he was so proud of. The final straw wasn't one event, but a slow erosion of her soul. It was the way he'd tell stories at dinner parties that subtly painted her as a flighty, impractical artist. It was the way he'd forget to mention her when accepting accolades for a successful app launch, even though she'd been the one managing their life, his schedule, and his emotional well-being, so he could work 18-hour days. He climbed the ladder of success on rungs she had held steady for him, and once he was high enough, he began to resent having ever needed the help. The divorce was acrimonious. Gregory, a master of narrative, framed it as him finally breaking free from a partner who couldn't keep up. He was magnanimous in public, telling friends he wished her the best with her little projects. In private, during the legal proceedings, he was ruthless. He fought for every asset, his arguments laced with insults about her earning potential and her unrealistic worldview. Eliza, exhausted and heartbroken, had conceded on almost everything just to be free. She kept her workshop, her personal savings, and her dignity. It felt like a fair trade. In the 2 years since Eliza had poured her pain and her passion into her work, she founded a small, bespoke fragrance house she named Ether and Elm. It wasn't a global brand, but it was hers. She worked out of a small, sunlit studio in a refurbished industrial building, creating signature scents for boutique hotels, private clients, and even a few theatre productions. It was a quiet success, a life rebuilt on her own terms, filled with the rich, complex notes of sandalwood bergamot and hard-won independence. And then there was Reese. Reese Donovan was the antithesis of Gregory Shaw. She'd met him not at a gala or a networking event, but at a local farmer's market. He'd been intently studying a stall of artisanal honey, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was tall and had a quiet intensity with eyes that seemed to notice everything. There was no flashy watch, no designer suit. He wore a simple linen shirt and jeans. He'd complimented the jasmine and vetiver scent she was wearing, one of her own creations. The conversation that followed was easy, intelligent, and utterly devoid of pretense. He told her he was in urban development, a description so mundane it was almost comical. It was only after their third date, when he'd taken her to a private viewing at the art museum after hours, that she began to suspect his life was more complex. A quick, hesitant Google search later confirmed it. Rhys Donovan wasn't just in urban development. He was the founder and CEO of Terra Nova Group, a multi-billion-dollar global firm renowned for its revolutionary work in sustainable architecture and green technology. He was a visionary, but a quiet one, a man who preferred blueprints to headlines. He was captivated by her world. He loved the stories behind her scents, the way she could describe a feeling in terms of top notes and base notes. He never asked when she would scale up, and he simply asked what she was creating next. With him, she didn't feel like a hobbyist. She felt like an artist. Their relationship was a sanctuary she guarded fiercely. In a city that thrived on gossip, they were remarkably private. Very few people knew they were together, which is why she hesitated when the invitation arrived. A thick, cream-colored cardstock embossed in gold, the 8th annual Visionaries of Tomorrow Gala. And there, listed as the keynote speaker and the frontrunner for the Entrepreneur of the Year award, was Gregory Shaw, CEO of Innovate Next. "We don't have to go," Rhys had said, noticing the immediate tension in her shoulders. "No, it's okay," Eliza replied, trying to convince herself as much as him. Her friend, a graphic designer named Chloe, had a nomination in a smaller category and had invited her as a +1 months ago, before the keynote speaker was announced. To back out now would feel like hiding. It would feel like letting Gregory still have power over her. "I'm not going to let him make me a recluse. It's been 2 years. I'm stronger than that." Rhys just nodded, his gaze steady and supportive. "All right, I'll come with you, if you want me to." "Really? You hate these things." "I do," he admitted with a slight smile. "But I'm quite fond of the person I'm going with." And so, she found herself putting on a deep emerald silk dress, the fabric cool against her skin. She dabbed a custom scent on her wrists, a blend of resilient oak moss, a heart of night-blooming jasmine, and a surprising sharp top note of pink peppercorn. It was her armor. As she looked at her reflection, she saw a woman who had survived. But as she and Rhys stepped out of the car and into the blinding flash of cameras on the red carpet, a cold knot of dread tightened in her stomach. She was walking back into Gregory's world, and she knew instinctively that he wouldn't let the evening pass without reminding her that she no longer belonged. The ballroom of the Fairmont Grand was a symphony of calculated opulence. Candelabras dripped with crystals, casting a fractured, glittering light over the sea of tuxedos and designer gowns. The air was thick with the murmur of 100 conversations, the clinking of champagne flutes, and the almost palpable scent of ambition. To Eliza, it felt like a beautiful, suffocating trap. This had been Gregory's natural habitat. He thrived in these rooms, navigating the currents of power with the effortless grace of a shark. He knew whose hand to shake, whose joke to laugh at, which journalist to grant a candid quote. Watching him work a room had once fascinated her. Now, the memory of it made her feel slightly ill. Rhys, by contrast, seemed to move through the space with a kind of invisibility shield. He was unassuming, his quiet presence, a stark contrast to the performative backslapping around them. He held her hand, his thumb stroking hers gently, a silent anchor in the overwhelming tide. He wasn't looking for anyone. He was simply looking at everything, his observant eyes taking in the architecture of the evening, the dynamics of the crowd, the subtle power plays unfolding at every table. You see that man holding court by the ice sculpture? Reese murmured into her ear, his voice a low rumble. That's Kenji Tanaka, the venture capitalist. The man he's talking to, Lawrence Finch, has been trying to get funding from him for 6 months. Watch Finch's posture. He's leaning in, but his smile doesn't reach his eyes. He's desperate. Tanaka knows it. Eliza looked and saw exactly what he described. It was a detail she would have missed, lost in her own anxiety. Reese didn't just see people. He saw the stories they were telling with their bodies. His perception was a quiet superpower. It made her feel seen, and in this room, that was a precious gift. They found their table, joining her friend Chloe, a bubbly redhead, whose nervous energy was a welcome distraction. Eliza, you look stunning, and you must be Reese. It's so good to finally meet you, Chloe gushed, giving him a warm smile. Reese was charming and gracious, immediately putting her at ease. For a while, Eliza allowed herself to relax. The conversation was light, focused on Chloe's nomination for her design work on a new indie app. They were just far enough from the main thoroughfare of the room to feel slightly removed from the epicenter of the schmoozing. But her peace was short-lived. A sudden shift in the energy of the room, a subtle turning of heads, announced his arrival. Gregory Shaw made his entrance not with a bang, but with the gravitational pull of a minor celebrity. He was dressed in a custom-tailored suit that was just a little too sharp, his smile just a little too wide. He was flanked by 2 junior executives who laughed a little too loudly at his jokes. He scanned the room, his eyes sweeping over the crowd like a conquering general surveying his domain. And then, his gaze landed on their table. It snagged on Eliza. His smile tightened for a fraction of a second before it was pasted back on, wider than before. He excused himself from his entourage and began to walk towards them. Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs. "Don't look," she whispered more to herself than to anyone else. "Breathe," Reese said softly, his hand finding hers under the table. His touch was firm, steadying. Gregory arrived at their table, casting a long shadow. Well, Eliza, I almost didn't recognize you." His voice was smooth, polished, but carried an undercurrent of something sharp and metallic. "Hello, Gregory," she said, her own voice commendably level. She refused to let it tremble. His eyes flicked from her to Reese, a flicker of assessment in his gaze. He saw a man in a well-made but unremarkable suit. He saw no obvious signs of wealth. He saw someone quiet, and in Gregory's world quiet meant insignificant. He dismissed him almost instantly. "I see you're still into your arts and crafts projects," he said, gesturing vaguely at her. "I hope they're keeping you busy." The insult was classic. Gregory, a compliment wrapped around a stiletto. Before Eliza could form a reply, Reese extended a hand. "Reese Donovan," he said, his tone neutral. Gregory gave his hand a perfunctory firm shake, a power move he'd perfected. "Gregory Shaw, CEO of Innovate Next." He said the name of his company as if it were a royal title. He didn't ask what Reese did. He didn't care. "I hear you're the main event tonight," Eliza said, steering the conversation away from herself. "Congratulations on the nomination." "It's more than a nomination, darling," Gregory said, the patronizing endearments landing like a slap. "It's a validation. It shows what's possible when you're not afraid to shed your baggage and aim for the stratosphere." His eyes held hers, making the meaning unmistakable. You were the baggage. The cruelty was so breathtaking, so blatant, that Chloe gasped softly. Eliza felt the blood drain from her face, but she held his gaze, a silent refusal to crumble. Reese's hand tightened on hers under the table. He said nothing. His face remained placid, almost detached. But Eliza, who knew him, saw a subtle shift in his eyes. The quiet observer had become a predator, watching, waiting. He wasn't just looking at Gregory anymore. He was reading him, analyzing him, finding the flaws in his code. Gregory seemed to relish her discomfort. "Well, I must be off. People to see, you know how it is. So glad you could make it out to see what real success looks like. It might be educational. With a final dismissive smirk, he turned and walked away, rejoining the orbit of admirers who were oblivious to the casual venom he had just dispensed. The silence at the table was heavy. What a complete and utter bastard, Chloe finally breathed, her eyes wide with fury. Eliza forced a shaky laugh. You have no idea. She looked at Reese, expecting to see anger, but his expression was one of intense, cold calm. Are you all right? He asked, his voice low. I will be, she said, taking a deep breath. He's Gregory. That's what he does. He needs to diminish others to feel big. Yes, Reese said, his eyes following Gregory's progress across the room. I'm beginning to see that. The lights dimmed, and a master of ceremonies walked onto the stage, his voice booming through the speakers, welcoming everyone to the gala. The show was starting, and Eliza knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that Gregory's performance was far from over. His little jab at the table was just the opening act. The first half of the awards ceremony was a blur of polite applause and overwrought speeches. Chloe's category came and went. She didn't win, but she was gracious, squeezing Eliza's hand with a resigned smile. The tension at their table had subsided into a low-level hum of anxiety. Every time a presenter mentioned Innovate Next, or Gregory Shaw, Eliza's stomach would clench. Finally, the moment arrived. The presenter, a well-known tech journalist, began the introduction for the Entrepreneur of the Year award. This year's recipient is a man who truly embodies the spirit of our theme, Visionaries of Tomorrow, she gushed. In just 3 years, he has taken a fledgling idea and forged it into a market-disrupting force. His company, Innovate Next, has redefined user engagement with its groundbreaking social aggregation platform, Nexus. A slickly produced video played on the large screens flanking the stage. It showed Gregory in various dynamic poses, pointing at a whiteboard, laughing with his young, diverse team, looking thoughtfully out of a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city. It was pure corporate propaganda, and it was effective. The room was buzzing with admiration. A man of unparalleled vision and relentless drive, the presenter concluded. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in congratulating this year's Entrepreneur of the Year, Mr. Gregory Shaw. The room erupted in applause. Gregory rose from his prime table near the stage, buttoning his suit jacket and beaming as if he'd just solved world hunger. He shook hands, clapped backs, and ascended the stairs to the stage with the practiced ease of a man who believed he was born for the spotlight. He accepted the heavy glass trophy, holding it aloft for the photographers. The flashing lights were like a swarm of angry fireflies. He stepped up to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and waited for the applause to die down. Thank you. He began, his voice resonating with false humility. Thank you so much. To be standing here is humbling, truly. Eliza watched her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Reese sat beside her perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the stage. Gregory launched into the expected platitudes. He thanked the awards committee, his investors, his incredible team, the real rock stars. It was a textbook acceptance speech, smooth and polished. But then his tone shifted. A more intimate, confessional quality entered his voice. You know, a lot of people see the success, he said, leaning into the microphone. They see the headlines, the growth charts, the awards, but they don't see the struggle. They don't see the sacrifices. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the silent audience. Success isn't just about what you build. He continued, his voice dropping slightly. It's about what you're willing to leave behind. It's about having the courage to cut away the dead weight, the things and the people that hold you back. A cold dread washed over Eliza. She knew exactly where this was going. Her blood ran cold. Early on, I had a partner, Gregory said, not looking in her direction, but she could feel the heat of his words as if they were a physical spotlight. The entire room was his captive audience. And this partner, well, let's just say their vision of the future was small. They were content with small things, small joys, small ambitions. They were happy to dabble in hobbies, to live in a world of make-believe, while I was trying to build an empire. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. People were exchanging confused, intrigued glances. This was not the standard script. I would come home after a 20-hour day of fighting for funding for survival. Gregory's voice swelled with theatrical pain, and I would be met with the smell of potpourri and impractical dreams. I was told my ambition was unhealthy. I was told I should slow down and appreciate the little things. But you don't change the world by appreciating the little things. You change the world by being a force of nature. The applause was more tentative this time, but it was there. He was framing his cruelty as a motivational lesson. Eliza felt 1,000 pairs of eyes on her. People were starting to put the pieces together, remembering she was the ex-wife. She could see the pity on some faces, the morbid curiosity on others. She felt naked, flayed open, her deepest wounds put on display for public consumption. She wanted to shrink, to disappear, but she was frozen in her chair, pinned by the spotlight of his voice. Her face was pale, but her spine was ramrod straight. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. And so, I had to make a choice, Gregory declared, his voice ringing with self-congratulatory strength. Do I let myself be anchored to a life of mediocrity, tethered to someone who doesn't understand the language of greatness, or do I cut the rope? He looked out over the audience, his gaze finally deliberately finding hers. He held it for a long, torturous second. A cruel, triumphant smirk played on his lips. I cut the rope, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that carried to every corner of the silent room. And I soared. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the most important entrepreneurial lesson I can share with you tonight. Don't let anyone who lacks your vision dim your light. Shed the dead weight, because some people are destined to be footnotes in the success stories of others. He raised his trophy. Thank you. The room was stunned. The silence was deafening, broken only by a few scattered awkward claps from his own table. He had gone too far. The air was thick with discomfort. Gregory had intended to look like a titan. Instead, he looked like a bully. But for Eliza, the damage was done. Tears burned at the back of her eyes, hot and acidic. The pain was sharp and visceral. A public shaming that scraped old scars raw. He hadn't just insulted her. He had tried to erase her, to rewrite their history, and cast her as a villain in his heroic tale. She felt small, humiliated, and utterly devastatingly alone. And in that moment of profound silence, a chair scraped against the floor. The sound of the chair scraping was sharp, decisive, cutting through the thick, uncomfortable silence of the ballroom. Every head turned towards the source of the noise. It was Rhys Donovan. He stood up, not abruptly, but with a deliberate, unhurried grace that commanded attention more effectively than any shout ever could. He placed his napkin neatly on the table. He gave Eliza's hand a brief, reassuring squeeze, a silent promise that reverberated through her entire being. Then he started walking towards the stage. He didn't storm it. He didn't run. He walked. His pace was measured. His shoulders were relaxed and his hands were empty. He moved through the maze of tables with an unnerving calm, his expression placid, almost blank. But his eyes fixed on the stage held a focus so intense it was like a physical force. The entire room seemed to hold its collective breath, watching this unknown man in the simple dark suit move with the purpose of a tidal wave. On stage, Gregory was momentarily confused. His moment of triumph was being interrupted. He still held the trophy, his smirk faltering as he watched Rhys approach. He clearly didn't recognize him from their brief, dismissive encounter at the table. To him, this was just some random guest, perhaps drunk, perhaps a protester. He shot a look at the event security, who were starting to move, unsure of how to react. Reese didn't even glance at them. He walked directly to the short set of stairs leading to the stage and ascended them one step at a time. The sound of his leather shoes on the steps was the only sound in the vast hall. He reached the podium. Gregory, now looking flustered and annoyed, stepped in front of the microphone, a defensive gesture. "Excuse me," Gregory said, his voice tight with irritation. "I believe I'm finished. Who are you?" Reese didn't answer him. He didn't even look at him. His gaze was fixed on the microphone, as if it were the only object in the room. He reached out a hand, not to grab it, but with a quiet expectation. It was a gesture that didn't request, but assumed compliance. "This is a private event," Gregory stammered, his bravado rapidly evaporating into blustering confusion. "Security." But the security guards had stopped. Something about the man's demeanor, his absolute lack of fear or aggression, gave them pause. He didn't seem like a threat. He seemed like he belonged there. Reese's eyes finally moved from the microphone to meet Gregory's. And for the first time, Gregory saw him, really saw him. He saw the cold, profound intelligence in his eyes. He saw a depth of power he couldn't comprehend, something ancient and unshakable that made his own flashy success feel like a cheap imitation. A flicker of recognition, or perhaps just primal fear, crossed Gregory's face. Still without a word, Reese gently, but inexorably, took the microphone from the stand. His fingers brushed Gregory's, and Gregory recoiled as if he'd been burned. He stumbled back a step, the heavy glass award suddenly looking like a foolish prop in his hands. The audience was utterly transfixed. This was a drama far more compelling than any award. Who was this man? What was he going to do? Eliza watched from her table, her heart a wild drum against her ribs. The humiliation and pain were still there, but now they were mingled with a new shocking emotion, awe. She had seen Reese's quiet strength in private moments, but she had never seen it unleashed like this. He wasn't being loud or aggressive, but the power radiating from him was absolute. He had taken control of the entire room without raising his voice. Reese stood at the podium, the microphone in his hand. He took a moment, his calm gaze sweeping over the silent, upturned faces of the crowd. He wasn't looking at them as a collective. It felt as though he was making eye contact with each and every person individually. The air crackled with anticipation. Finally, he brought the microphone to his lips. He took a soft breath, and the sound was amplified throughout the hall. He looked towards his table, his eyes finding Eliza's. He gave her a look of profound reassurance, a silent message that said, "I've got this. The truth is coming." Then he turned his attention back to the silent waiting room, and he began to speak. "Good evening," Reese Donovan said, his voice calm, clear, and carrying an unexpected weight of authority. "My name is Reese Donovan, and I need to correct the record." Reese Donovan's voice was not loud, but it filled the cavernous ballroom, a blade of quiet clarity, cutting through the tension. He didn't project the manufactured charisma of Gregory. He simply spoke, and everyone listened. "I am Eliza Reed's partner." He began the statement, landing with simple, irrefutable force. A wave of whispers immediately broke out. The anonymous woman Gregory had just eviscerated was not alone. She was with him. "And I've just listened to Mr. Shaw's rather creative version of history. I feel a more accurate account is in order. Not for his sake, but for hers." He turned his head slightly to look at Gregory, who stood frozen a few feet away, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. "Mr. Shaw speaks of vision," Reese continued, his tone turning clinical, analytical. "It's a powerful word, but a true visionary sees the value in things others dismiss. They see the strength in quiet dedication, the profit in integrity, the innovation in art." Shaw in his speech confessed that he saw none of that. He only saw what he failed to understand. Reese's gaze swept back over the audience. He mentioned the smell of potpourri and impractical dreams. What he failed to mention is that the impractical dreamer he lived with, Eliza Reed, is the founder of Ether and Elm, the custom fragrance that greets you when you enter the lobby of this very hotel. The Fairmont Grand, the one they've received international accolades for. Eliza created that. The signature scent for the Celestine Hotel chain's new line of spas across Asia. She secured that contract last week. Her hobby, Reese said, letting the word hang in the air with dripping irony, is projected to clear 7 figures in revenue this year. That's not a footnote. That's a headline. A gasp rippled through the room. The narrative had been completely flipped. The pitied ex-wife was a formidable success in her own right. Eliza felt a hot blush rise to her cheeks, a mixture of vindication and shock. He had been paying more attention to the details of her business than she'd ever realized. Now, Reese's attention locked back onto Gregory, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop by 10 degrees. The quiet observer was gone. The predator had been unleashed. But let's talk about Mr. Shaw's vision. Reese said, his voice hardening almost imperceptibly. Let's talk about Innovate next. At the mention of the company, a man at a front table, Kenji Tanaka, the venture capitalist Reese had pointed out earlier, leaned forward, his expression now one of sharp professional interest. The name of my firm is Terra Nova Group, Reese stated calmly, and my venture capital division, Terra Nova Ventures, keeps a close eye on emerging tech. Innovate Next and its platform Nexus came across our desk for a second-round funding evaluation last quarter. Gregory's face went white as a sheet. He looked like he'd been struck by lightning. He knew the name Terra Nova. Everyone in the room knew that name. It was a titan, a kingmaker. Reese Donovan wasn't just some random boyfriend. He was one of the most powerful and elusive investors on the planet. The quiet man in the simple suit held Gregory's entire future in the palm of his hand. Our due diligence was thorough. Reese said the word thorough sounding like a death sentence. We found some interesting things. We found that Nexus, the market-disrupting force, has a user engagement rate that is 6% lower than what was reported to its initial investors. We found that over half of its registered accounts show bot-like activity designed to inflate its user base to attract exactly this kind of attention, this kind of award. The silence in the room was now absolute, broken only by the sound of Gregory's ragged breathing. This wasn't a personal takedown anymore. This was a corporate execution. We found a company with a brilliant marketing narrative, Reese continued, his voice relentless, but a product that is hemorrhaging money built on a foundation of deceptive metrics. We found a CEO who was so focused on building his personal brand that he neglected to build a sustainable business. Our official recommendation, Mr. Tanaka, he said, nodding briefly to the venture capitalist, was to decline funding and to flag the company for a potential SEC inquiry regarding fraudulent statements to investors. That report was finalized yesterday. Kenji Tanaka's face was grim. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod back to Reese. The message was clear. Gregory Shaw was finished. Reese wasn't done. He held up his hand, gesturing vaguely at the stage. The lights, the award. And finally, this award, the Visionaries of Tomorrow. A wonderful honor. It's sponsored, as you all know, by the Atherton Group. As it happens, Terra Nova completed its acquisition of a controlling interest in the Atherton Group this morning. The press release is scheduled for 9 a.m. tomorrow. He paused, letting the final devastating blow land. So, as the new de facto head of the committee for this award, allow me to be the first to say, congratulations, Mr. Shaw. Please enjoy your trophy. I'm afraid it's the only thing of value your company has left. Reese Donovan placed the microphone carefully back on its stand. The click it made echoed like a gunshot in the silent hall. He turned, gave Gregory one last dismissive glance, the look one might give an insect, and walked calmly off the stage. Gregory Shaw stood alone, bathed in the spotlight, clutching his worthless award. His face was a canvas of utter ruin. He had tried to publicly destroy one person's reputation, and in return, a man he had dismissed as a nobody had systematically, factually, and irrevocably annihilated his entire world in less than 5 minutes. The spell broke. The ballroom, which had been held in a state of suspended animation, erupted into a cacophony of frantic whispers. Phones came out not for pictures, but for frantic, hushed texting. The journalists in the room were scribbling furiously, their faces alight with the thrill of a career-making scandal. The narrative of the night had been shattered and rewritten in real time. Gregory Shaw, the visionary, was now Gregory Shaw, the fraud. He was still on stage, a statue of humiliation. The lights felt harsh now, accusatory. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked wildly around the room, but the faces that had been adoring just minutes before were now filled with scorn, pity, or cold professional calculation. His investors were avoiding his gaze. His team members were inching away from his designated table. He was an island and the tide was going out. Reese reached their table. He didn't say a word. He simply held out his hand to Eliza. She took it, her fingers lacing with his. Her own hand was trembling, not from fear anymore, but from the sheer, overwhelming adrenaline of what had just happened. He gently pulled her to her feet. "Let's go." He murmured, his voice for her ears only. Chloe was staring, her jaw slack. "My God," she whispered. "My God." As Reese led Eliza away from the table, the crowd parted for them, as if they were royalty. The whispers followed them, a wave of intrigue and respect. People weren't looking at her with pity anymore. They were looking at her with a kind of awe. She was the woman who had inspired that takedown. She was the artist, the success story. He had not just defended her, he had validated her in front of the very people Gregory had tried to impress. They didn't speak as they walked through the grand lobby, the doorman rushing to open the door for them. They didn't speak in the cool, leather-scented interior of the car as it pulled away from the curb. Eliza stared out the window at the glittering city lights, but she didn't see them. She was replaying the last 10 minutes over and over in her mind. The raw, public pain of Gregory's speech, the cold dread, and then the astonishing, terrifying calm of Reese rising to her defense. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't been emotional. He had used the truth as a weapon, dissecting Gregory's lies with surgical precision. It was more brutal and more effective than any fistfight could ever be. Finally, as the car sped silently along the highway, she turned to him. His face, in the intermittent glow of the streetlights, was calm again. The quiet observer returned. "You knew," she said, her voice soft. "You knew all of that about his company." He nodded. "The report came across my desk a few days ago. It was flagged for my personal attention because the submission mentioned a prior connection between the CEO and a notable artisan in our network." He gave a small, wry smile. "That was you. I started digging. The Atherton Group acquisition was coincidental but timely." She processed this. He hadn't just reacted in the moment. He had been prepared. He had walked into that gala armed with facts, ready to deploy them if necessary. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, a genuine question, not an accusation. "It wasn't my news to share," he said simply. "And I was hoping I wouldn't have to use it. I was hoping he would have the decency not to force the issue. I was wrong." He turned to her, his expression serious. "Eliza, my only concern in that room was you. Are you okay?" The question, so simple and so sincere, broke through her shock. The tears she had refused to shed in the ballroom now welled in her eyes. It wasn't just tears of hurt from Gregory's attack, but tears of profound, overwhelming relief. Of being seen, of being valued, of being championed in a way she had never thought possible. "No," she whispered, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "But I will be." She reached out and took his hand. "Thank you, Reese. I've never had anyone stand up for me like that. You should have never been put in a position where you needed someone to, he said, his voice firm. What he did was unforgivable. He didn't just insult you, he tried to invalidate your entire existence, your passion, your success. I just provided a factual counter-narrative. She let out a shaky laugh that was half a sob. A factual counter-narrative, Reese. You just performed a public vivisection. He smiled, a genuine warm smile that transformed his face. His lies created a vacuum. All I did was fill it with the truth. The rest took care of itself. She leaned her head against his shoulder, the tension finally draining from her body. She had walked into that gala, fearing the ghost of her past. She was leaving with a future that felt more solid and more real than ever before. It wasn't because a billionaire had saved her. It was because her truth had finally been spoken aloud in a room full of witnesses. And her success, the quiet, fragrant, beautiful thing she had built from the ashes of her marriage, was now shining brighter than any fraudulent award ever could. The night that had begun with her public humiliation had ended with her complete and total vindication. The fallout was not a wave, but a tsunami. Eliza woke the next morning, not to her usual gentle alarm, but to the frantic, incessant buzzing of her phone on the nightstand. It vibrated with such intensity, it sounded like an angry hornet trapped in a jar. Bleary-eyed, she reached for it. The screen was a blinding cascade of notifications. Dozens of text messages, a backlog of missed calls from numbers she didn't recognize, and email alerts pinging every few seconds. She sat up in bed, her heart beginning to pound with a nervous rhythm. She clicked on a news alert from a major financial journal. The headline screamed in stark black letters, "Visionary to villain tech, CEO Gregory Shaw accused of massive fraud in onstage meltdown." Beneath it was a grainy photo of Reese at the podium, his expression calm and implacable, with a smaller, inset photo of Gregory's ruined face. She scrolled through the article, her breath catching in her throat. It was all there, laid out in devastating detail. Anonymous sources from Innovate Next were already confirming the bot farms and inflated metrics. A quote from Kenji Tanaka read, "We value integrity above all else." Terra Nova's due diligence merely confirmed suspicions we were beginning to have. And the story of Reese Donovan's connection to the Atherton Group, the award's sponsor, was the final brutal twist that had turned the story from a corporate scandal into a legend of boardroom warfare. Her name, Eliza Reed, and her company, Ether and Elm, were mentioned repeatedly, but with a tone of reverence. She was cast as the unsung, authentic artist, the catalyst for the truth's dramatic unveiling. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Chloe. Eliza answered, her voice still thick with sleep. "Oh my God, Eliza, are you alive?" Chloe shrieked, her voice a mixture of glee and concern. "Have you seen the internet? You're like a folk hero. They're calling you the perfumer who toppled a phony empire." Eliza couldn't help but let out a weak laugh. "That's a bit dramatic." "Dramatic?" He got what he deserved. It was biblical. I have never ever seen anything like it. Reese is... I don't even have words. He's like a quiet James Bond, but instead of a Walther PPK, he uses facts and due diligence reports. "Are you okay, though? Seriously?" "I am," Eliza said, and was surprised to find she meant it. "It's strange, Chloe. I thought I would feel triumphant, vindicated, but mostly I just feel quiet." She looked around her calm, sunlit bedroom. "It feels like a storm has passed that I wasn't even fighting in. He built a house of cards, and Reese just blew on it." "Well, that quiet storm just sent a hurricane of business your way, I hope you know," Chloe said. "My friend who works at Vogue just texted me asking for your contact info. She wants to do a feature, not on the drama, on you, on your work." After she hung up, Eliza sat in the silence for a long moment. It was true. Gregory's downfall didn't bring her joy. It brought her closure. It was the final, definitive slamming of a door she had been trying to gently close for years. His destruction was a monument to his own choices. Her future, however, was suddenly a wide-open landscape, and the phone buzzing with inquiries from Vogue was the first sign of that new territory. The following days were a whirlwind. Eliza fielded calls from journalists, turning down the ones who wanted to focus on the scandal, and cautiously accepting interviews with publications focused on art business and design. She spoke to buyers from prestigious retailers she had only dreamed of approaching. In one surreal phone call, a director from Neiman Marcus praised the brand integrity and authentic narrative of Ether and Elm, wanting to discuss an exclusive placement in their flagship stores. During the call, Eliza found herself speaking with a newfound confidence, articulating her vision, not as a defense, but as a statement of fact. Her work had always been worthy. The world was just finally catching up. One afternoon, while she was meticulously labeling a batch of her Fairmont Grand Essence, a news alert popped up on her tablet. It was a photo of Gregory taken from a distance by a paparazzo. He was unshaven, wearing a hoodie, looking pale and gaunt as he hurried out of a law office. He looked like a stranger, a ghost. Eliza felt a brief, fleeting pang of something not pity, but a sad acknowledgement of the waste. The brilliant young man she had once loved had been consumed entirely by the insecure, cruel man he had become. She swiped the notification away without a second thought. That evening, Reese came to the studio. He didn't knock, just let himself in, carrying a bag of takeout from their favorite Thai restaurant. He found her not frantically working, but sitting quietly on a stool, simply breathing in the complex air of her own creation. The chaos of the week had finally subsided. "I thought you might be tired of the world," he said softly. "I am," she admitted. "But I'm also invigorated." She looked at him, her gaze clear and direct. "I need to ask you something, Reese. That night, seeing you on that stage, it was the most terrifying and incredible thing I have ever witnessed. A part of me was horrified by the sheer power you wielded. It felt so absolute." He nodded, accepting her words without defense. "Power is a tool, Eliza, like a scalpel. You can use it to harm, or you can use it to heal by cutting out a sickness. What Gregory did wasn't just an insult. It was a public lie meant to poison your truth. My world, the world of finance and development, is built on trust and numbers. His actions were an offense to the basic principles of that world, and a much, much greater offense to you. Using that tool wasn't a pleasure. It was a necessity." She stood and walked towards him, closing the distance between them. "I know. My head knows that, but my heart is still trying to understand it." She reached up and touched his cheek. "What I do understand completely is what you did for me, not for my honor, for my work." Her voice was thick with emotion. "When you described my business, my art, you gave it a weight and a seriousness that Gregory spent years trying to strip away. You saw its value. You told the world it had value. You didn't save me, Reese. You amplified me. Your work was already a symphony," he said, his voice a low, warm rumble as he took her hand. "You just needed the world to quiet down enough to hear it." She smiled, a slow, radiant smile that felt like the dawn. "Well, the world is listening now." She led him over to a clean, uncluttered section of her workbench. A single, elegant bottle stood there, filled with a pale, amber liquid. It had no label. "I've been working on something new," she said. "Something for me, to mark this new beginning." She picked it up and sprayed a delicate mist onto her wrist, the alcohol evaporating to leave a complex shimmer of scent. She offered it to him. He leaned in, his eyes closing as he inhaled. The fragrance told a story. It opened with the bright, resilient spark of pink peppercorn, and bergamot, a flash of defiance and light in the dark. That initial sharpness then yielded to a warm, impossibly beautiful heart of night-blooming jasmine, and rich, velvety, rose a testament to love and hidden strength. And beneath it all, the foundation, the scent that lingered on the skin, was a deep grounding and unshakable accord of oak moss, vetiver, and sacred sandalwood. It was the smell of ancient forests, of resilience, of deep roots that could weather any storm. It was the scent of a woman who knew her own worth. "It's beautiful," Reese breathed. "What is it?" Eliza looked from the bottle to his face, her eyes shining with unshed tears of pure joy. "I'm calling it counter-narrative," she said. It was the fragrance of her truth, her art, her soul, and it smelled finally and completely like freedom. In the end, this wasn't just a story about a billionaire saving a damsel in distress. This was the story of Eliza Reid, an artist whose quiet, authentic success became the loudest voice in the room. It's a powerful reminder that true strength isn't about shouting the loudest, but about the integrity of what you build. Gregory Shaw's empire, built on lies, crumbled in an instant. Eliza's built on passion and truth is just beginning to flourish. It proves that the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's living a life so full and successful that the past no longer has any power over you. What did you think of Reese's epic takedown? Was it justified? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.
In the ruthless world of New York's elite, a public humiliation is a spectator sport. Richard Sterling thought he'd won the final round against his ex-wife, Catherine. He had the money, the power, and the dazzling new fiancée. He thought he'd left Catherine with nothing. But what happens when the woman you tried to erase doesn't cry? What if she just smiles, turns her back, and walks up the steps of a private jet that makes yours look like a toy? This is a story of how the quietest exit becomes the loudest statement of all. Stick around, the revenge is just getting started. The air in the Sotheby's auction room on York Avenue was thick with the scent of old money and new ambition. It was a suffocating blend that Catherine Hayes had once found intoxicating. Now it just smelled of decay. She sat alone in the 10th row, a ghost in a simple, elegant navy blue dress, a stark contrast to the glittering peacocks preening around her. Her presence was a quiet rebellion. For 5 years, she had been Mrs. Richard Sterling, a name that opened every door in this city. Now she was just Catherine Hayes, and the only door she was interested in was the one marked Exit. Across the room, Richard was holding court. He wasn't just present, he was performing. His voice, a booming baritone she once found comforting, now grated on her nerves. He was flanked by his new fiancée, Isabella Rossi, a woman who looked like she had been sculpted from marble and draped in diamonds. Isabella was 26, a decade younger than Catherine, with the kind of effortless beauty that demanded attention. On her finger, a diamond the size of a small quail's egg caught the light, shooting out blinding white daggers. Richard made sure everyone saw it, his hand, protectively, possessively on Isabella's, turning it this way and that as he greeted acquaintances. He was a master of the subtle boast, the casual display of overwhelming wealth. Catherine focused on the catalogue in her lap. Lot 37, a collection of rare handwritten letters from Virginia Woolf to Vita Sackville West. They were intimate, raw, and beautiful, a conversation across time between two brilliant women. They had been her holy grail for years. During their marriage, Richard had scoffed at her dusty old papers, preferring to invest in art that screamed its value from the wall. He couldn't understand the quiet thrill of holding history in her hands. The bidding for the letters began. Catherine's heart hammered against her ribs. This wasn't about Richard. This was for her. She raised her paddle. The numbers climbed, fast and furious. It was a duel between her and a man in the front row with a slicked-back ponytail. Finally, the ponytail man shook his head. The auctioneer's gaze fell on Catherine. "Sold," he was about to say, when a new voice, loud and clear, from the back of the room, cut through the tension. 200,000. Every head turned. It was Richard. He hadn't even been paying attention. He was looking directly at Catherine, a cruel, triumphant smirk playing on his lips. Isabella giggled, a tinkling, artificial sound. Catherine's blood ran cold. He was doing this purely to spite her. He knew what these letters meant to her. It was a power play, a public humiliation. She took a deep breath, straightened her spine, and raised her paddle again. 225,000. Richard laughed, a short, sharp bark. 300,000. The room was silent now, all pretense of polite chatter gone. It was a spectator sport. The ex-wife versus the new fiancé's champion. Catherine's savings could cover this, but it would be a stretch. This was no longer about the letters. It was about drawing a line in the sand. 350,000, she said, her voice betraying a slight tremble. Richard's smirk widened. He didn't even say the number. He just nodded to the auctioneer. The auctioneer, a man named David Abernathy, who had known them both for years, looked uncomfortable. 400,000 to Mr. Sterling. Catherine looked at Richard. He was a predator, toying with his prey. He was enjoying this. He wanted to see her break. He wanted her to retreat defeated. But as she met his gaze, she didn't feel defeated. She felt a strange sense of liberation. He could have the letters. He could have the victory. He was buying pieces of paper. She was buying her freedom. She gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head to the auctioneer. "Sold?" Abernathy's gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed the breaking of the final invisible chain that had tied her to Richard Sterling. To Mr. Richard Sterling. A polite, scattered applause broke out. Richard leaned over and kissed Isabella a long, theatrical kiss for the benefit of the audience. Catherine stood up. She didn't look at them. She turned and walked out of the auction room, her back straight, her head held high. She didn't see the confused look on Richard's face as he watched her go. He had expected tears, a scene, a storming out. He had not expected this quiet, dignified retreat. He had won the battle, but as Catherine disappeared into the New York City crowds, he had the unsettling feeling that he had just lost the war. He held up his prize, the letters he didn't want, and for the first time felt the hollowness of his victory. The ghost had left the building, but her specter remained a question mark hanging in the expensive air. 2 days later, the sky over Teterboro, New Jersey, was a brilliant cloudless blue. It was the kind of day that made the private jets lined up on the tarmac gleam like jewels. Catherine Hayes stood by the entrance to the Signature Flight Support Terminal, a single well-worn leather suitcase at her feet. She was dressed for travel in a simple cream-colored cashmere sweater and black trousers. She was flying to London for a book fair, a trip she had planned months ago, a celebration of her new, unencumbered life. A black Rolls-Royce Phantom purred to a stop a few feet away. The driver, a man in a crisp uniform, hurried to open the rear passenger door. Out stepped Richard Sterling, followed by Isabella, who was swathed in a fur coat that was utterly inappropriate for the mild autumn day. Richard's eyes scanned the area and landed on Catherine. He feigned surprise, a poorly acted charade that was almost insulting. "Catherine, what a coincidence," he boomed, striding towards her. Isabella clinging to his arm. "Richard," Catherine said, her tone flat neutral. She didn't have the energy for his games today. Off somewhere? He asked, his gaze flicking to her single suitcase, a silent judgment on her modest luggage compared to the mountain of Louis Vuitton trunks being unloaded from his rolls. London, she replied simply. Ah, London. Business, I assume. Still playing with those dusty old books. He gestured vaguely, a dismissive wave of his hand. Before Catherine could answer, he pulled Isabella forward. Darling, you remember my ex-wife, Catherine? Catherine, this is my fiancée, Isabella Rossi. Of course, Isabella said, her voice dripping with manufactured sweetness. She extended her left hand, not for a handshake, but to display the ring. The diamond, a flawless cushion-cut behemoth, was impossible to ignore. It was a weapon designed to blind and intimidate. Richard has told me so much about you. I'm sure he has, Catherine said, her eyes meeting Isabella's. She didn't look at the ring. This deliberate lack of acknowledgement was a small act of defiance, but it was hers. Richard, annoyed that his trump card was being ignored, pressed on. We're off to St. Bart's for a few weeks, a little pre-wedding getaway, you know how it is. The stress of planning the wedding of the century, why, it takes its toll. He sighed, a theatrical display of the burdens of the ultra-wealthy. Our jet is just being prepared. He pointed towards a large but slightly dated Bombardier Global Express. Your flying commercial, I take it, must be trying. The condescension was so thick, Catherine could have choked on it. She thought of the years she had endured this, the constant subtle digs, the psychological warfare designed to make her feel small, inadequate. She had absorbed it all, letting it chip away at her sense of self. But no more. Something like that, she said, a faint, enigmatic smile touching her lips. Just then, a low hum grew into a powerful roar. An aircraft impossibly sleek and futuristic was taxiing towards their terminal. It was a Gulfstream G800, the latest and largest purpose-built private aircraft in the world. Its pearl-white fuselage shimmered in the sunlight, its wingtips raked back like a bird of prey. It made Richard's Bombardier look like a relic. The jet came to a graceful stop directly in front of them. The door opened, and a staircase descended with a silent hydraulic hiss. A flight attendant, in a sharp, tailored uniform, appeared at the top of the stairs. Ms. Hayes, we are ready for you. Catherine picked up her suitcase. She turned to Richard and Isabella. Their mouths were slightly agape, their eyes wide with disbelief. The triumphant smirk had vanished from Richard's face, replaced by a look of utter slack-jawed confusion. Isabella's grip on his arm had tightened, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his expensive suit. It was interesting seeing you both, Catherine said. Her voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable note of finality in it. Have a wonderful time in St. Bart's. She walked towards the jet, her steps unhurried, her posture perfect. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She could feel Richard's stunned gaze on her back, a silent testament to the seismic shift that had just occurred. As she ascended the stairs and disappeared into the cool, quiet interior of the G800, the door ceiling shut behind her, Richard Sterling was left standing on the tarmac, the gaudy diamond on his fiancée's hand, suddenly looking small and insignificant under the shadow of the magnificent aircraft that had just swallowed his ex-wife whole. The ghost of his past had not only returned, she had upgraded, and he had no idea who he was up against. The interior of the Gulfstream G800 was a sanctuary of understated luxury. There was no gold-plated tackiness, no ostentatious displays of wealth that Richard would have insisted upon. Instead, the cabin was a symphony of soft grays, cream-colored leather and dark polished wood. It was spacious, quiet, and calming. As Catherine settled into a plush armchair, a sense of peace washed over her, a feeling she hadn't realized she had been missing for years. A man emerged from the forward cabin, a tumbler of amber liquid in his hand. He was tall, with a lean, athletic build that his impeccably tailored suit couldn't conceal. His hair was dark, with distinguished flecks of silver at the temples, and his eyes, a startlingly intelligent shade of blue, crinkled at the corners as he smiled at her. This was Julian Croft. "I saw that little drama on the tarmac," he said, his voice a low, pleasant rumble. "I almost sent the co-pilot out with a bucket of popcorn." He handed her a glass of water. "Are you all right?" "I'm better than all right," Catherine said, taking a sip. "I think I just shed the last 10 pounds of a very toxic marriage." Julian laughed, a genuine warm sound that filled the cabin. He took the seat opposite her. "Richard Sterling, I had my team do a little digging after you first mentioned him. A classic narcissist. All flash, no substance. His entire self-worth is tied to the perception of others. Men like that are incredibly fragile." "You have no idea," Catherine murmured, looking out the window as the jet began its powerful, smooth ascent. The world and her past shrank beneath them. She had met Julian Croft 6 months ago at a small independent bookstore in Greenwich Village. She had been reaching for a first edition of Mrs. Dalloway, and so had he. They had struck up a conversation, a real conversation, about books, art, and the quiet joys of a life lived outside the spotlight. He had introduced himself as Julian, a consultant. It was only weeks later, after a series of long dinners and walks through Central Park, that she discovered consultant was a massive understatement. Julian Croft was the founder and CEO of a global technology firm that specialized in data security and artificial intelligence. He was a billionaire, but he wore his wealth like a comfortable, well-worn coat, not a suit of armor like Richard. He was fiercely private, rarely photographed, and his name was more likely to be found in the footnotes of academic journals than in the gossip columns. He was flaunting his fiancée's ring, Catherine said, a small, wry smile on her face. It was the size of a doorknob. "And you?" Julian said, his blue eyes twinkling, countered with a G800. "A rather effective checkmate, I thought." "It wasn't my intention," she said, though she couldn't deny the small, wicked thrill she had felt. "But I'm not going to pretend it wasn't satisfying." "Good," Julian said. "You've spent too long diminishing yourself to make a small man feel big. That chapter is over." He reached across the table and took her hand. His touch was warm, firm, and reassuring. "How are the Virginia Woolf letters?" Catherine's heart sank a little. "He bought them. Outbid me at the Sotheby's auction. It was a deliberate act of cruelty." Julian was silent for a moment, his expression unreadable. "I see." He took a sip of his drink. "Well, perhaps it's for the best. Sometimes you have to let go of old things to make room for the new." He changed the subject, steering the conversation towards the London Book Fair, asking her about the dealers she was excited to meet, the lectures she planned to attend. He listened, truly listened, his attention focused entirely on her. It was this more than the private jet or the limitless resources at his disposal that was the true measure of the man. He saw her, the real her, the woman who loved dusty old books and quiet afternoons. With Richard, she had been an accessory, a beautiful object to be displayed. With Julian, she was a partner. As they flew east, chasing the sun, Catherine felt a profound sense of rightness. The turbulence of her past was finally smoothing out into clear, open skies. She was no longer a ghost at someone else's feast. She was the guest of honor at her own. She leaned her head back against the soft leather, the hum of the powerful engines, a lullaby of her new life. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt completely and utterly safe. The man in the jet was not just her billionaire boyfriend. He was her safe harbor, the quiet, steady anchor in the storm she had just escaped. And together, they were flying towards a future she was finally excited to embrace. Richard Sterling stood on the tarmac at Teterboro, long after the Gulfstream G800 had become a silver speck in the vast blue sky. The roar of its engines had been replaced by a ringing in his ears. The triumphant high from the auction, the smug satisfaction of flaunting his wealth, had evaporated, leaving a bitter, metallic taste in his mouth. "Richard, darling, are we going?" Isabella's voice, usually a melodic purr, was sharp, impatient. The pre-wedding glow had been replaced by a pout. Her perfect St. Bart's vacation was being delayed. "What was that?" Richard muttered, not to her but to himself. "Whose jet was that?" "How should I know?" Isabella snapped, pulling her ridiculous fur coat tighter around her. "Does it matter? It's probably a rental. She's probably shacking up with some vulgar new money type to pay her bills." But Richard knew it wasn't a rental. He had seen the discreet custom logo on the tail fin, a stylized C intertwined with a J. That was a private insignia. That was ownership, and the G800, he knew what those cost. The base model was nearly $80 million. With custom interiors, you were pushing $100 million. That wasn't new money. That was a different stratosphere of wealth, a level that made his own considerable fortune feel pedestrian. The flight to St. Bart's was tense. Richard was silent, staring out the window, replaying the scene at the airfield over and over in his mind. Catherine's calm, her enigmatic smile, her complete and utter lack of intimidation. It was as if she was a different person. The quiet, accommodating woman he had divorced, the woman he had so easily crushed at the auction, was gone. In her place was this cool, confident stranger who boarded $100 million jets as if she were hailing a taxi. As soon as they landed and checked into their beachfront villa at the Eden Rock, Richard was on the phone. He called his PI, a former NYPD detective named Sal Moretti. "Sal, I need you to find something out for me," Richard said, pacing the marble floors of the villa. "A Gulfstream G800 tail number. I didn't get it, but it had a custom logo on the tail, a J and a C intertwined. A G800. That's a big bird, Richard. Not many of those around," Sal said. "What's this about?" "My ex-wife was on it." Richard said the words, tasting like ash. "Catherine, I thought she was, well, you know." "Yeah, well, apparently not," Richard grumbled. "Find out who owns it, and find out who she was with. I want a name, Sal. I want to know everything." The wait was agonizing. Richard tried to play the part of the doting fiancé, taking Isabella to designer boutiques in Gustavia and to dinner at Benito, but his heart wasn't in it. His mind was elsewhere, consumed by the mystery of Catherine and her new life. Isabella, sensing his distraction, grew increasingly petulant. "Richard, are you even listening to me?" she complained over a plate of ridiculously expensive lobster. "I was talking about the seating chart for the wedding. We can't put my mother next to your Aunt Carol, not after the incident at the engagement party." "Fine, whatever you want, Isabella," he said, waving his hand dismissively as he checked his phone for the 10th time that hour. The call from Sal came 2 days later. Richard was sitting by the infinity pool, a cocktail sweating in his hand. "I have a name for you, Richard." Sal said, his voice grim. "But you're not going to like it." "Just tell me," Richard snapped. "The jet is registered to a shell corporation, but the beneficial owner is a man named Julian Croft." The name meant nothing to Richard. Julian Croft. Who the hell is Julian Croft? He's the founder and CEO of a company called Helios AI. They're a global tech firm. Data security, artificial intelligence, government contracts. He's very, very private. Almost a ghost. No social media, very few public photos. But he's significant. Significant. What does that mean? How much is he worth? This was the metric Richard understood. This was the language of his world. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Richard, this guy isn't in your league. He's not even playing the same sport. We're talking about a net worth estimated to be north of $30 billion. With a B. The cocktail glass slipped from Richard's hand and shattered on the stone patio. $30 billion. The number was so vast, it was almost incomprehensible. It was a figure that turned his own $250 million net worth into pocket change. It was the kind of wealth that didn't just buy jets. It bought influence, power, silence. It was the kind of wealth that could make a man like Richard Sterling disappear without a trace. "Are you sure?" Richard whispered, his throat suddenly dry. "I'm sure," Sal said, "and there's more. I looked into Croft's recent activities. He's a major philanthropist, but he does it all anonymously. A few months ago, one of his foundations made a significant acquisition in the world of rare books and manuscripts." A cold dread washed over Richard. What? What acquisition? He bought the entire archives of the Hogarth Press, the publishing house founded by Virginia and Leonard Woolf. The entire collection. Letters, manuscripts, first editions, everything. It was a private sale, very quiet. The seller was a small, struggling university press in England. Richard sank into a lounge chair, his head spinning. The letters. The Virginia Woolf letters he had bought at Sotheby's to humiliate Catherine. They were a drop in the ocean compared to what this man, this Julian Croft, had given her. Richard had bought her a page. Croft had bought her the entire library. The dusty old papers Richard had mocked were now the foundation of a collection curated by one of the world's richest men. Catherine hadn't lost at the auction. She had just been letting him win a meaningless skirmish while she was on her way to claiming an empire. He looked at Isabella, who was taking selfies by the pool, pouting her lips at her phone's camera. He looked at the diamond on her finger, the ring he had been so proud of. It suddenly looked cheap, garish, a desperate plea for attention. His world, so carefully constructed on a foundation of perceived superiority, was beginning to crack. And in those cracks, a terrifying, new reality was taking root. Catherine Hayes, his mousy, unassuming ex-wife, was now involved with a man who could buy and sell him 100 times over without even noticing. The unraveling of Richard Sterling had begun. The annual Conservation Gala at the Metropolitan Museum of Art was the glittering apex of the New York social season. It was a night where fortunes were pledged, reputations were polished, and the city's intricate power dynamics were on full public display. For Richard Sterling, it had always been a home game, a night to reinforce his status at the center of this universe. This year, however, the universe seemed to have tilted on its axis. He and Isabella arrived in a flurry of camera flashes, Isabella in a Scarlett O'Hara-esque crimson gown that was designed to make an entrance. Richard, in a classic Tom Ford tuxedo, played his part, smiling for the cameras, his hand firmly planted on the small of Isabella's back. But his eyes were scanning the crowd, searching for a ghost. He didn't have to search for long. He saw her across the great hall, standing near the entrance to the Temple of Dendur. It was Catherine, and she was breathtaking. She was wearing a simple column-like gown of deep sapphire silk that shimmered under the lights. Her hair was styled in a sophisticated chignon, and her only jewelry was a pair of delicate diamond and sapphire earrings. She was talking to a small group of people, and as she laughed at something one of them said, the sound seemed to carry across the cavernous space a note of pure, unadulterated joy. Beside her, his hand resting lightly on her arm, was Julian Croft. In person, he was even more imposing than Richard had imagined. He radiated a quiet intensity, a stillness that was more powerful than Richard's practiced bravado. He wasn't looking around the room, seeking approval or attention. His focus was entirely on Catherine. The whispers started almost immediately. "Is that Catherine Hayes? Who is she with? I've never seen him before." "That's Julian Croft, the Helios AI guy." "No, it can't be. He never comes to these things." "Well, he's here now, and he can't take his eyes off her." Richard watched as a procession of people he had considered his allies, his friends, made their way towards Catherine and Julian. People who had dropped Catherine from their guest lists the moment the divorce was announced. People who had sided with him, who had listened to his version of the story. Now, they were fawning over her, their smiles wide, their laughter a little too loud. He saw Jonathan and Beatrice Vance, a couple he had known for 20 years, practically elbow their way through the crowd to greet Catherine with effusive air kisses. Beatrice had once told Isabella that Catherine was a lovely girl, but a bit of a bore. Now she was hanging on Catherine's every word. The ultimate humiliation came when Richard and Isabella approached the main receiving line for the museum's director, Daniel Weiss. They were standing behind the Vances, who were now chatting animatedly with Catherine and Julian. As the line moved forward, Daniel Weiss greeted the Vances, then his eyes lit up as he saw the couple behind them. "Julian, I can't believe you made it," Weiss said, bypassing Richard completely to shake Julian's hand warmly. "And Catherine, you look absolutely stunning. We were so thrilled when we heard about the endowment for the new manuscript wing. It's a game changer for us." Richard froze. The manuscript wing, he shot a look at Catherine. She met his gaze, her expression calm, unreadable. There was no triumph in her eyes, no "I told you so." There was just a quiet confidence that was more unnerving than any overt display of victory. "Richard, Isabella, so good to see you," Weiss said, finally turning to them, his tone polite but noticeably cooler. The moment was fleeting, but in the shark-infested waters of Manhattan society, it was a mortal wound. They had been snubbed. Publicly, Isabella was seething. "What was that all about?" she hissed as they moved away from the receiving line. "A manuscript wing? Is that where her new boyfriend is parking his money? How utterly dull." But Richard knew it wasn't dull. It was strategic. It was a display of power that was both subtle and absolute. He wasn't just buying her jets. He was building her legacies. He was immortalizing her passion in the stone and glass of the world's most famous museum. What could Richard's diamond ring compete with that? Throughout the dinner, the humiliation continued. Their table, usually a prime spot near the stage, was in a less desirable location closer to the kitchens. From across the room, Richard could see Catherine and Julian seated at the director's table, flanked by senators, artists, and titans of industry. He watched as Julian leaned over and whispered something in Catherine's ear, making her laugh. The intimacy of the gesture was a knife in Richard's gut. He was losing. He was losing a game he hadn't even known he was playing. His wealth, his status, his beautiful fiancée, the pillars of his identity, were proving to be a house of cards in the face of Catherine's new reality. He had thought he had erased her, but instead she had been reborn stronger, more radiant, and powered by a force he could not comprehend or compete with. The whispers at the Met were a death knell for the world he had known. The ghost of his past was now the queen of the ball, and he was just a spectator in the cheap seats watching her coronation. The days following the Met Gala were a slow-motion nightmare for Richard Sterling. His world, once a glittering fortress of his own making, was being dismantled brick by brick. The story of his public snubbing had become a cautionary anecdote whispered over cocktails at the Bemelman's bar and dissected at lunches at La Goulou. Business associates, who once clamored for his time, now had secretaries who informed him they were in meetings indefinitely. He was a ghost in his own life, haunting the edges of a world that no longer wanted him. His relationship with Isabella crumbled under the pressure. Her affection had been transactional, a currency exchanged for the status he provided. With his social capital plummeting, she had become openly contemptuous. The wedding planning devolved into a theater of cruelty. "Are you sure you can still afford the custom-built ice sculpture of two swans kissing?" she asked one evening, her voice dripping with venom as she browsed a bridal magazine. They were in their cavernous Fifth Avenue apartment, which suddenly felt less like a palace and more like a gilded cage. "Perhaps we should scale back. We don't want to look desperate. It's so unbecoming." The final fatal blow came 2 weeks after the gala. Richard was banking on a merger with a rival firm, a deal that would have been a lifeline, a public declaration that he was still a player. The CEO, a man named Marcus Thorne, with whom he'd shared cigars and golfed for years, called him personally. "Rich, bad news," Marcus said, his voice strained with false sympathy. "The board's got cold feet, unforeseen market volatility." But Richard heard the truth in the silence between the words. Marcus's wife, a formidable woman who chaired 2 museum boards, had been at Daniel Weiss's table at the Met. She had witnessed his humiliation firsthand. It wasn't market volatility, it was social contagion. He was toxic. A black venomous rage began to boil in his gut. It was a potent cocktail of wounded pride, consuming jealousy, and a bizarre, twisted sense of ownership over the woman at the center of it all. Catherine. It was all her fault. He became obsessed. He had his PI Sal send him daily reports on her movements on Julian Croft. He learned that Croft had not only bought her the Hogarth Press archives, but had also established a fellowship in her name at Columbia University for the study of modernist literature. Each new detail was another twist of the knife. Driven by this corrosive fury, he did something he knew was reckless. He found out where she was living. It wasn't hard. The entire city was buzzing about the triplex penthouse Julian Croft had recently purchased at 220 Central Park South, the so-called Billionaire's bunker. He went there on a Tuesday afternoon, a man on a mission of self-destruction. In the taxi ride downtown, he rehearsed his speech, a tirade of accusations and blame. When he arrived, he strode into the limestone-clad lobby, a place of hushed, intimidating wealth. The doorman, a man he would have once tipped $100 without a thought, regarded him with cool indifference. "I'm here to see Catherine Hayes," Richard announced, his voice a little too loud. "Is she expecting you, sir?" the doorman asked, not moving. "We're old friends." Richard bluffed the words, tasting like acid. He flashed a Patek Philippe watch like a badge of honor, but the doorman was unimpressed. Richard's name, it seemed, was no longer a key that opened all doors. He was forced to use a connection, calling a friend on the building's board to be allowed up. The humiliation of it stoked his rage even further. He rode the private elevator, its walls lined in brushed bronze, his heart pounding a frantic, angry rhythm. The ascent was silent smooth and felt like a journey to his own execution. When the doors opened directly into the apartment's foyer, he was momentarily stunned into silence. The space wasn't just large. It was a testament to a level of taste and wealth he'd only ever pretended to have. The marble floors were a seamless expanse of white, veined with subtle gray. The floor-to-ceiling windows framed Central Park like a living masterpiece. The art on the walls was quiet but significant, a small, pensive Rothko, a delicate Twombly. There was no gold, no glitz, none of the gaudy, look-at-me decor he favored. It was the home of someone who didn't need to shout about their money. And there, standing in a pool of afternoon sun, was Catherine. She was arranging a simple bouquet of white tulips in a vase, and she didn't look surprised to see him. She just looked weary. "Richard," she said, her voice devoid of emotion, "you shouldn't be here. I needed to talk to you, Tick," he snarled, striding into the room. "What is this, Catherine? What are you doing?" "I'm arranging flowers," she replied, her preternatural calmness infuriating him. "Don't play dumb with me," he exploded, his voice cracking. "This," he gestured wildly, his arm encompassing the whole panoramic view. "The jet, the gala, this palace in the sky. Who are you? You are my wife. You were a librarian's daughter from Ohio. I found you. I made you. You were perfectly happy with a book and a cup of tea." "I'm still that person, Richard," she said quietly, placing a final tulip in the vase. "You just never bothered to look closely enough to see the rest of me. You saw a reflection of yourself, and you were angry when I didn't match the image you'd created." "And him," Richard spat the word out. "This Julian Croft, you leave me, and you immediately find one of the richest men in the world. Is that what this was all about? Were you planning this all along? Playing the mousy little bookworm while you waited for a bigger fish?" Catherine finally put down her garden shears and turned to face him fully. Her eyes, which he had once thought of as merely pretty, were now blazing with a cold fire he had never seen before. "No, Richard, that's your playbook, not mine. You're the one who equates a person's worth with their bank balance. I fell in love with a man who listened to me, who respected me, who saw me as an equal. His wealth is incidental. It's his character that I love." "Character?" Richard laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You think he has character? Men like that don't get to where they are by being nice guys. They're sharks, Catherine, just like me." "You're wrong," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper that was more chilling than a shout. "He's nothing like you." She took a step closer, and for the first time, Richard felt a flicker of actual fear. "And speaking of character, I think it's time we had an honest talk about yours." She walked over to a sleek, minimalist desk and picked up a slim, leather-bound folder. "Julian's people, as you would call them, are very thorough. When he fell in love with me, he became concerned about you. Not as a rival, but as a threat. So they did a little digging into our marriage, into our finances." She opened the folder. "Do you remember the Sterling Opportunities Fund, the private investment fund you started during our last year together? The one you told me was too complicated for me to understand?" Richard's blood ran cold. "That's none of your business. It became my business when you forged my signature on the incorporation documents, making me a liable partner without my knowledge," Catherine said, her voice like ice. "It became my business when you used it as a shell to illegally hide marital assets from our divorce settlement. And it became my business, Richard, when you used it to commit insider trading based on confidential information you wheedled out of my father's oldest friend at the SEC, a dear man you knew I trusted implicitly. She slid a document across the polished surface of the desk. It was a copy of a wire transfer from the Sterling Opportunities Fund to an offshore account dated 2 days before a major corporate acquisition was announced. A transaction Richard had thought was buried under layers of corporate deceit. "This is a copy," she said, her voice steady and clear. "The originals, along with a sworn affidavit from your former accountant, a man you fired without severance last year who was more than happy to talk, are with the SEC. They are very interested in your complicated fund. The merger you were so excited about, it didn't fall through because of market volatility. It fell through because Marcus Thorne was given a friendly, anonymous warning that he was about to merge with a man under active federal investigation." Richard stared at the paper, his world collapsing in on itself. The bravado, the anger, the jealousy, it all drained away, replaced by a cold, sickening dread. He had been so focused on Catherine's new life, on the man she was with, that he had never considered that they might be looking back at him with a high-powered telescope. He had seen her as a ghost to be haunted, not a force to be reckoned with. "Why?" he whispered, his voice cracking the sound, pathetic even to his own ears. "Why are you doing this?" Catherine looked at him not with hatred, but with a kind of profound, sad finality. "You could have just let me go, Richard. You could have taken your petty victory at the auction and your new life and just walked away. But you couldn't. Your ego wouldn't allow it. You had to try and crush me one last time. You had to prove you were the winner. Well, congratulations. You've won. You've won an SEC investigation, the end of your engagement, and the complete and utter destruction of the reputation you worked so hard to build." She walked past him towards the window, overlooking the park, turning her back on him for the last time. "The doorman will show you out. Goodbye, Richard." He stood there for a long moment, a statue in the ruins of his own life, before turning and walking towards the elevator, a defeated man, finally truly understanding the meaning of the word loss. He had not just lost his wife, he had lost himself in the process. The confrontation was over, and there was no doubt who had emerged the victor. The Mediterranean sun was a warm liquid gold blanket on Catherine's skin. She was lying on a plush lounger on the deck of the Ataraxia Julian's magnificent 200-foot sailing yacht as it cut a silent, graceful path through the turquoise waters of the Aegean Sea. The name, she had learned, was the Greek philosophical term for a state of serene calmness, of being undisturbed by life's chaos. It was a perfect description of her life now. It had been 6 months since the confrontation in the penthouse, 6 months since Richard had walked out of her life and into the ruins of his own. The fallout had been swift and brutal, a public spectacle that Catherine had watched from a quiet distance. The SEC investigation had become front-page news, with the Wall Street Journal running a series of articles detailing the Sterling Opportunities Fund scandal. They painted a damning portrait of a man consumed by greed and arrogance. Isabella, in a move of breathtakingly predictable self-preservation, had fled the sinking ship. Her publicist issued a statement, dripping with faux sincerity, announcing the end of the engagement due to irreconcilable differences in personal ethics. The statement went on to detail Isabella's newfound commitment to philanthropic causes that support transparency and female empowerment. The last Catherine had heard Isabella was being photographed on the arm of a minor European royal with a storied title and notoriously empty pockets. She had traded one form of currency for another. Richard, stripped of his company, his fiancée, and his reputation, had been forced to sell his assets at fire sale prices to cover his legal fees and fines. The Bombardier jet, the Rolls-Royce, the Fifth Avenue apartment, all were gone, liquidated to pay for his hubris. He had retreated from public life, a disgraced footnote in the annals of New York society. Catherine felt no joy in his downfall, only a quiet, sad sense of inevitability. He had built his life on a foundation of sand, and it had been washed away by a tide of his own making. Julian emerged from the cabin, a tray in his hands, bearing 2 glasses of chilled white wine and a small plate of figs and cheese. He sat down beside her, his presence a comforting warmth that had become the anchor of her world. "A message came through for you on the satellite comms," he said, handing her a glass. "From David Abernathy at Sotheby's." Catherine raised an eyebrow. "Oh, I thought I was off his list of high-value clients." Julian's eyes twinkled with amusement. "Apparently you're back on it. It seems a certain collection of Virginia Woolf's letters to Vita Sackville West are back on the market. The previous owner defaulted on his payment." He let the statement hang in the warm air. "Abernathy was wondering if you were still interested. He said he could secure them for you privately before they go to auction again." Catherine stared out at the endless blue horizon. She thought about the letters, about the desperate hunger she had felt for them. She thought about the woman she had been in that auction room, feeling small and powerless, seeing those pages as a lifeline to a world of substance she felt denied. She thought about the sting of Richard's casual cruelty, and she realized with a sudden, startling clarity that the hunger was gone. "No," she said, a slow, genuine smile spreading across her face. "Tell him thank you, but I'm not interested." Her passion for those letters had been a symptom of a deeper need, a need to connect with a life of the mind, a life of meaning that had been starved in her marriage. Now, she was living that life every day. She and Julian spent their evenings reading to each other, debating philosophy, and planning the curriculum for the new literary foundation they had endowed. The letters were a symbol of a craving that had now been satisfied. "I have the real thing now," she said, turning to him, her eyes shining. She leaned over and kissed him, a slow, deep kiss, filled with gratitude and a peace she had once thought unattainable. "I don't need to buy someone else's love letters." Julian smiled, a deep, contented smile that reached his eyes. "I'm glad to hear that." He gestured towards a small, leather-bound book on the table beside them, an object she hadn't noticed before. "Because I have something for you." Catherine picked it up. The leather was soft and worn, a deep navy blue. There was no title on the cover, only a small embossed C in the bottom corner. She opened it. Inside, on the first page, in elegant, familiar handwriting, were the words, "The collected thoughts of Julian Croft, on first meeting Catherine Hayes and thereafter." She looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise and overwhelming emotion. "You wrote this?" "I started it the day we met in that bookstore," he said, a faint, endearing blush on his cheeks. "I jot down things after our conversations. It's a bit rambling, I'm afraid, and my penmanship is terrible, but it's all true." Her fingers, trembling slightly, turned the pages. It was filled with observations about her quotes from books they had discussed, half-formed poems and heartfelt declarations of his growing love. One entry, dated a week after they met, read, "She speaks of books not as objects, but as old friends. Her passion isn't for the value of a first edition, but for the soul of the story within. She is the rarest thing I have ever encountered, a person who is entirely authentically herself. It was more intimate, more precious than any collection of famous letters could ever be. It was their history, their story written not for the world, but just for her. It was proof that she had been seen, truly seen, from the very beginning. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the ink on the page. But they were not the tears of sadness or humiliation she had once known so well. They were tears of pure, cleansing joy. The ghost of her past was finally completely gone. The auction, the ring, the drama, it all felt like it had happened to someone else in another lifetime. She closed the book and held it to her chest as if it were the most valuable thing in the world, and to her, it was. She looked out at the endless expanse of the sea, at the horizon, where the blue of the water met the blue of the sky. It was a vista of infinite possibility. She had her own letters now, her own story, her own quiet, unshakable love. This was her new beginning, and it was more beautiful than anything she could have ever dared to imagine. In the end, this wasn't a story about the triumph of wealth over wealth. It was a story about the triumph of substance over flash, of character over reputation. Catherine Hayes didn't need a billionaire to save her. She needed to save herself, to remember the woman she was before the world told her who she should be. Julian Croft wasn't her rescuer. He was the partner she deserved, a man who valued her mind more than her appearance, her passion more than her pedigree. Richard Sterling's empire crumbled because it was built on ego and illusion. Catherine's new life is flourishing because it's built on the bedrock of authenticity, respect, and a love that is as deep and as real as the sea. What did you think of Catherine's ultimate revenge? Let us know in the comments below. If you love stories of dramatic twists